Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for November of 2020. We have 12 records to get through, so I will recommend if you want to jump to an album, jump around the review to see which albums in particular you want to check if you don't want to watch this whole experience. All the time codes are linked in the description. Also, if there's an album that you know I haven't covered this year yet and you want to get it covered before the year's over, leave it in the comments down below. I'm going to try to comb through a lot of catch-up, whatever new stuff drops, and my own personal sort of things I've been kind of putting on the back burner for too long this upcoming month. So get all that going if you want. But without further ado, let's go ahead and start reviewing.
Take it all in the mouth and make the straight cough. Cocaine boss.
We're starting the month off with a bang. Busta Rhymes dropped a new record this year, the first one in a while, and I like some Busta Rhymes. I like him a decent amount. I talked him up a lot in my favorite Posse Cuts video, but outside of that, I also really like a lot of Busta's studio work. I think that he's a very good rapper. I think he's very cartoonish in a great way. His personality is big in a great way, and I feel like on this new record, ELE 2, which acts as a sequel to his 1998 classic ELE, Extinction level event, he brings back everything you would have loved about Busta Rhymes, or that was a staple to Busta Rhymes, both good and bad to a degree. I like this record a decent amount. I think it's very solid, but it has the follies that even some of my favorite Busta Rhymes albums have. And the biggest complaint that I have with that is that it's too long. It's way too long. Even the records of his I like, even if there's a majority of the tracks I do like, there's some that could have been left on the cutting room floor, and that issue is a lot more glaring on the records of his that I don't think aren't as good. You know, Busta has this really big approach to his records. They're all super lengthy, and while I think this record, again, is a little more column A than column B, it kind of meets in the middle in that sort of regard. What I do like about this is that it does bring back Busta in a big way. I didn't listen to his Year of the Dragon record. I wanted to when it came out, but it was like a Google Play exclusive. It was a weird thing, but I like that this record does a couple of things. One, continues some sort of the apocalyptic, vibes that ELE had, which makes a lot of sense given 2020 has been the year that it's been. And he talks about politics on some tracks on here, but I also like how he melds the old vibes, old hip-hop, staples or artists with the new, and a nice harmonious marriage. There's a lot of harmonious marriages going on this project conceptually. I love the intro, and the intro is kind of the embodiment of that by having Busta come together with Rakim and Pete Rock throwing in some production on there. And that alone feels like just a staple, of the 90s. That's like a who's who of rap greats in the 90s, or at least a good pairing of two rappers from the 90s that were very prolific. And it also introduces Chris Rock, who is Busta Rhymes' hype man throughout this entire record. And I really like that attribute of this, because Busta Rhymes, like I said, he's very cartoonish, he's very expressive, his personality is gigantic. I almost said gigantic. It's gigantic. And Chris Rock is the same. Very brash, very bold comedian, very outlandish, expressive delivery. And the two are almost kindred spirits in that regard. And I feel like they complement each other incredibly well. I love Chris Rock on this project a lot. And again, that sort of acts as like the mission statement for the project. It's going to be a little apocalyptic, and it's going to be a little reflective of the old style of hip-hop. And that shines by bringing M.O.P. back on Czar, by sampling Poison's Belle Biv DeVoe's track on Out of My Mind, by bringing ODB verse into reality on Slow Flow, which is a great highlight of the record, having Q-Tip back in the cut after, Busta was on the Last Tribe record. It's cool to see Q-Tip come back on here. Mariah Carey has a track on here, and Mary J. Blige, and both of those tracks work very well. Mariah has her own sort of smooth vocal lines, and Mary J. Blige have a similar, style, but the two tracks have very different aesthetics. And he melds that with more contemporary artists like Rick Ross and Master Fard Muhammad. The great Kendrick Lamar feature on Look Over Your Shoulder, where Kendrick is pulling together some really, classic at this point Kendrick bars. Rhapsody's on Best I Can, and I love that track. That's another great highlight of the record, where Rhapsody and Busta sort of talk about, their the other parents of their kids and how sometimes they can paint the other in the kids' eyes, even though they're trying to do the best that they can. And I really appreciate that. But there's some tracks that just, they don't feel as necessary. You know, they are very Busta Rhymes, but they're Busta Rhymes on 10 in a way that I don't really enjoy. Whether it's inconsistent production, like on Czar, tracks like Boomp, or You, and I was really excited for an Anderson .Paak Busta Rhymes collaboration, because you guys probably know, I really love Anderson .Paak, man. I think Anderson .Paak is an incredible artist. I love his voice, I love the production he usually brings on his projects. I just think he's an incredibly talented guy. But him and Busta just don't mix, man. That You is a track that really detracts from the record to me personally. I also don't like the Rick Ross track all that much. I'm not the biggest Rick Ross fan. You know, I think he kind of fits Busta. Again, the two kind of work together really, really well. But it's just not my favorite track on the record. And again, this record's just a little too long. Whether it's interludes that are added to an already lengthy runtime, or really just a general pacing issue. I don't like this record as much as I was hoping to, because I do enjoy Busta Rhymes a lot. You know, like I said, it has everything you would expect from Busta Rhymes, good and bad. And while I do think it's better than some of his weaker records, it does sit somewhere in the middle for me. I'm giving this a 6 out of 10. I think that it's great to see a dude who's been in hip-hop for so long, who's continued to be a prominent voice in the genre. While it's been a while since Busta's last record, he's been very prolific, and I like that he's kept himself, you know, he's kept himself trained, as it were, as a rapper, because he does shine, personality-wise. It's just a little much at times.
It's just a random thought I had that everyone's an offspring.
We got another year, which means we have another Atmosphere project, apparently, because Slug and Ant have been super prolific over the last couple of years, starting with 2018's Mi Vida Local. Not to say they haven't been prolific over the last decade, but they haven't done this sort of consecutive release thing in a minute. And I like Mi Vida Local. I thought it was like a darker twist and a little more reflective in a darker sense to some of the dad rap styles, you know, Slug's been doing for pretty much this whole decade. I liked Whenever for its more laid-back vibe. Maybe not as much as Mi Vida Local, but I still thought it was a very solid record. We got a new Felt record this year, produced exclusively by Ant, and I really enjoyed that. I thought it was a nice return to form of their two chemistries, Slug and Merz's. And this new Atmosphere record, The Day Before Halloween, might be the best Atmosphere record we've had in a long fucking time. It's better than Mi Vida Local for fucking sure. You know, because they took the idea of putting an album out before Halloween and making it spooky. It's a spooky Atmosphere record, and I really, at least as far as like production-wise, Slug does his thing and makes it dark at points, but the production across the board, this might be some of my favorite Ant production, at least, in the last 10 years. I love the synths on here. You guys know, I love me some horror synth. I love some spooky synthesizers, and across this record, you know, tracks like Space is Safe, The New People, She Loves My Not, Double Town, Stardust, Sleep Apnea, all tracks with great foreboding synths that have some nice, sharp-sounding synth stings to add to that horror atmosphere. You know, there's these low rumbles that coat some of the instrumentals. And they take that and make an abstract record out of it. This is one of the more abstract experimental records I feel like Atmosphere's done in a while. You know, Slug, it's not just all hooks, or it's not like trying to fit a structure. There's a lot of like weird, just sort of, Slug comes in, he spits a verse, it's really ambiguous, and then he leaves. There is some hooks on here, and I like some of them. I like Space is Safe's hook a little bit. I like the building of I've Got So Much Trouble on My Mind, or closing out the verses of I've Got So Much Trouble on My Mind from Bitter Acid Reflux Syndrome. But some of the hooks, like on Party Crashers or She Loves My Not, don't hit as hard. I think some of the subject matter feels a little weird, like the future is disgusting. It feels like it's trying to sit in that dark, spooky realm, but in like a really, you know, aggressive sort of way that I don't think works on the track at all. That track, I like its sort of disco rap instrumental, but it also kind of sticks out amongst the dark, murkier sounds that this record's exploring. Party Crashes is another track that I just don't think works as well as the rest of the record. It's sort of the instrumental components clash a little too hard for me. But by the by, I love this record. I love the forebodingness on a lot of it. I love Ant's delivery on tracks like Space is Safe, Double Town especially, Sleep Apnea. I love the closer on this record. You know, it's another one of those tracks where Slug kind of comes in, spits a little bit, and then comes out, but the darkness on that track fits the MO of the sounds of this record, and he taps into it really well, and there's some vocal effects, like on Space is Safe, that have that sort of darkness to it that, again, fits the theme of the record, and I like this record a lot. Like, I feel like if you enjoy classic atmosphere, check this record out. You'll probably like it more than a lot of the stuff they've done recently. If you like horror synth, wait for the instrumental version of this record to drop and listen to it. Because again, the instrumentals on this, some of the best Ant has done in ages. I just wish it were longer. That's my biggest complaint. You know, some of the tracks don't necessarily work, but I just want more of this. I know they're probably not going to do more, because Slug and Ant are always doing, you know, different shit, at least as far as conceptually over the last couple of records. But I like this. I could use more of this, guys. You know, I like that they're keeping it weird, they're keeping it different, they're bringing back some just weird ideas, and I think they're doing it well. I'm giving this an 8. You know, I was sitting between a 7 or an 8 in my mind. While there's a couple tracks I don't like, I think this is a very compelling record, even if it is only for a bit of time. My boy, Aesop Rock, came back with a new record. I thought he was just going to have his Freedom Finger EP, which I have heard. I think it's dope. I'll talk about it at the end of the month. But this new record, Spirit World Field God, I wasn't expecting since he dropped that soundtrack. But when he dropped The Gates, and I loved its sort of glitchy, almost chiptune-ish production, I thought it was great. And then he dropped Pizza Alley, which felt even greater. You know, he was really hyping up this record as being a sort of concert or a conceptual type experience. And I feel like this record's trying to do a decent amount, but it sticks the landing across the board. The contrast to the Atmosphere record I just talked about, this has a whole lot of Aesop. This is a beefy fucking record, but I feel like it doesn't overstay its welcome because Aesop gracefully jumps between subjects, whether tying into the concept with tracks like Crystal Sword or Boot Soup, or even kind of tapping into the sort of unnerved nature that being in the spirit world could be, like Dog at the Door or Gauze. He melds those tracks perfectly with tracks that almost seemingly expand upon him being more reflective in his obtuse way, like he was in The Impossible Kid, like on Pizza Alley or Kotokushi or Sleeper Car, while also having very insular conceptual tracks like Flies or Side Quest, which Flies is literally just about fruit flies that were in his house, and he wrote a track about it. And Side Quest is about skateboarding, something that he posts about a lot on his Instagram. And I think it's actually kind of cool because after this record released, Aesop on his Instagram has just been doing frequent Q&As, and I think that that's sick. And he's addressed some questions people have had about flows that he's done, because there's tracks like 1 to 10 where he's kind of rapping in a weird time signature, and he addresses shit like that. He talks about, you know, the beat construction. One of the things I was going to say in this review is that seemingly he was sort of inspired by the Freedom Finger soundtrack he did, because some of the beats, again, have that glitchy sort of game-like production, like on The Gates, like I aforementioned, and some of the synth lines, like on Gauze, Coveralls, which is another fucking bop, or Holy Waterfall. But he actually started making this before he made that soundtrack, and it just sort of bled into the soundtrack. He also kind of seemingly felt like he was influenced by Tobacco from the Malibu Ken project that he pulled together last year, because the production has that sort of digital touch to it in a sort of Tobacco-esque way. And he talked about being influenced by Tobacco in one of these Instagram Q&As. And that kind of shows, but in a way that feels still very Aesop. It feels like a melding of the synth-style scene on The Impossible Kid with the synth-style scene on Malibu Ken. I think this record's great. If you can tell, I fucking love this record. It's Aesop being Aesop. It's really, again, dense and verbose lyrically. I really enjoy the way he paints a picture. I like how he utilizes these different textures in a really cool way. You know, I think that this is another just great notch in Aesop's belt. I think this record is an incredible journey. Again, I like how the sort of mystical pictures painted on tracks like Crystal Sword and Button Masher fit really well against these other tracks, and nothing really clashes. Everything just melts together in this harmonious marriage. I think this is an incredible record. I'll be doing a recontextualized review, injecting this into his discography sometime next year, but I really enjoyed Spirit World Field Guide, and I feel like it's another great, again, if you liked stuff like The Impossible Kid and Skeleton, this is sort of just a natural progression for his sound to make. Loving it a lot. I'm going to be giving this an 8 out of 10. I Don't Know How, But They Found Me features Dallin Weeks from Panic at the Disco and Ryan Seaman from Falling in Reverse coming together to make this band that doesn't really sound like either project that they may be affiliated with, and create something that's a little bit of a hodgepodge of ideas that other bands have done into something that I think comes together relatively solidly. I got into this project because my buddy John, shout out to ARTV one time, sent me the opening single of this track, Leave Me Alone, and I was really intrigued by it. I liked its funkier groove, I loved its chorus, and I think that its production suited the synth textures incredibly well. And what this record does are tracks like that, with tracks like Mad IQ's New Invention, and some of the more synth-driven tracks like Sugar Pills and Lights Go Down, but they pair those with these almost Jukebox the Ghost, Muse and Scope tracks like Nobody Likes the Opening Band, Door, and From the Gallows, which I think also sound really decently, with these more just melding of those two worlds with tracks like the title track and Cluster Hug a little bit. But I don't think all of those components meld together cohesively. Like, I like the sounds on here. Again, I like those synth textures. I think the grandiosity and the vocal harmonies that they lay down work relatively well, if don't sound a little bit too derivative. You know, the synth stuff kind of sounds like Big Data, but a little bit better. The Jukebox the Ghost stuff sounds a little bit better than Jukebox the Ghost, but it leads to a jarring pacing, and it leads to a really inconsistent experience across the board. I wouldn't say I'd do a redacted of this someday, because I don't necessarily like this record that much to do so, but I do think if you sort of rearrange the tracks a little bit, give it a little bit of a more consistent pacing, because going from tracks like New Invention to From the Gallows, or tracks like the sleek Mad IQs into a ballad-esque break, just creates this weird experience for the listener. At least it did to me with subsequent listens. I like what's here, but I think it's just a little all over the map and feels a little scattershot as a result. And I don't think a majority of the hooks hit as hard as Leave Me Alone or come to a great close like the closer does. I like the sentiment of a track like Nobody Likes the Opening Band, and I think it builds to a really good crescendo. From the Gallows does a similar effect. But some of the tracks like Sugar Pills, I really don't like the use of synthetics on Sugar Pills, and some of the tracks near the tail end just kind of feel a little more forgettable, but it's a solid enough record on its own. If you like these two artists, or you heard tracks like Leave Me Alone and you want to hear what the whole record sounds like, I don't think you'd walk away wholly disappointed, but you wouldn't necessarily love your experience unless you really like both of the sonic components these artists are going for. But I think it's solid enough. I'd give it like a 6 out of 10. It's fine. It's just nothing completely mind-blowing. So one of my friends at work, shout out to Legend one time, recommended the newest Chloe and Halle record, Ungodly Hour. He stands their music. I'd never really heard of him before, and I looked into them. I didn't know that they were managed by Beyonce, and they've also kind of been all over the map. They act, they've had songs on like the Wrinkle in Time soundtrack. They're kind of making a name for themselves in their lane, and they're definitely backed by some industry peeps. But they've swept completely under my radar. But I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for their music in the future, because I think Ungodly Hour is an incredibly solid release. You know, I think the songwriting is very honest and has its own sense of personality to it. You know, they wrote it themselves, which is very impressive given that they are so deep in the industry as it were right now. You know, they're working with dudes like Scott Storch and Mike Will Made It, but they seemingly write a lot of their music still, which is awesome. I think that their voices are incredibly impressive. I think that they meld really well together and stand out on their own just as well. You know, I love a lot of the personality that shines on tracks like Busy Boy, where they're talking about dudes, you know, sending dick pics and, you know, while also trying to treat them like a side chick. You know, I love the grandiosity in the title track. I even like, even though the production isn't necessarily theirs, I like how they meld over some of the production, like on tracks like Don't Make It Harder on Me, which has this classic R&B feel that I think works incredibly well for their voices. And I like the track with Sway Lee and Mike Will Made It as well. I don't think that Mike's production is as good as their own, but I think it doesn't stray too far off from it and works incredibly well. And I actually think, as much as I hate Scott Storch, I think he's an incredibly tacky producer. Lonely is a really well-produced track that, again, taps into the emotional resonance that the track's trying to deliver incredibly well and works well as a whole. I think that this record is solid. The biggest distractors, I think, from it are some of the production. Do It, I don't think, is as good as Lonely if we're comparing the Scott Storch songs. While I like the title track's grandiosity and I like the textures on some of the production on tracks like Forgive Me, I think those are some of the better collaborative produced tracks. Given how much I love the production on tracks like Tipsy and Baby Girl, I want to hear more of Chloe's production. She's actually a pretty good producer. Her lo-fi touch suits their sound the best, you know, and I feel like even tracks like Overwhelmed, which is this small little interlude, again, has this airiness to it that suits their voices so perfectly. I think it's cool that they're getting to work with these bigger producers, and again, some of the ones that pop really pop and don't detract too much, aren't too much less than the self-produced stuff, but I think that this is honestly a great showcasing of talents across the board, and I would have loved to have seen their talents in a production stance work better. I think they could have done a better job with some of these songs and some of the producers that they did, especially Do It. I like Do It, but I don't think the beat knocks as hard as it's trying to. But I like this record. I think this record is actually very, very solid. I feel like if you like very soulful R&B, you like some really honest writing that taps into female empowerment, like on Baby Girl, or, again, just has a huge sense of scope, like on the title track, you'll enjoy this record. Definitely one that I've liked revisiting and spinning a lot over the last month, and one that I'll be definitely picking some tracks for if I'm wanting to get sort of a good vibe going. It's got some good vibes for sure. But I think it's solid, really good. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. Thanks for the recommendation. There's always one band, it's seemingly, if not a few, in a year's time that I'll look at, that I used to really listen to back in the day, and see what they're up to. And Heaven Shall Burn are one of those bands. I used to listen to them a lot in high school, but immediately after I graduated high school, I kind of left them behind for greener pastures. But they dropped a record, so I figured why not, for the first time in 10 years, listen to a Heaven Shall Burn record. And it's a double album that's 97 minutes long. And for a band like Heaven Shall Burn, who are very, I don't want to say one note, but they are pretty much a 10 at all times, just constant throttling of pummeling guitars, intense drums, and harsh vocal lines. By the end of this 97-minute run, it's a little degrading. It's a little, not degrading, it's a little much. It's a little hard to keep spinning. Not that they don't do things to break up that, like the opener in general, before the heavy crunchy guitars come in, has this sort of softness to it that kicks the record off really well. Tracks like Ubermach and La Resistance inject some electronic glitchiness in there that I think helps retexturize the sound a little bit. And they have a track like The Ashes of My Enemies and Expatriate that have more soft, grand, lush embellishments throughout it, and that I think work really well. And in fact, Expatriate actually melds their heaviness with some grandiosity incredibly well. And there's other tracks that have these sort of grand swells in them that are backed behind their beefy guitars. But I just, at the end of the day, I couldn't consistently sit through this record. It's a lot. It's a 19 track, 97-minute jaunt. Most of the tracks cross the 5, almost 6-minute mark. And for a band like Heaven Shall Burn, who, like I said up at the top, are very atonal, very their one sound, which they do well in their history that I've known them. I was listening to some of their older records after I thought about them again for the first time in a decade. I still like some of their older stuff, and I think that they pull together some really dark, heavy moments. But in this record, where they're seemingly trying to aim for the stratosphere, their sound just gets very monotonous amongst this runtime. There's highlights for sure, and I dig the ambition behind wanting to do a double album, but this was just not a record that I wanted to revisit because it was too much. You know, I talked about the Busta Rhymes record being a bit much, but at least he tries to do more with his runtime. And Heaven Shall Burn, for all the experiments they do, they just don't pick up enough. I'm giving this a 5. No slack to the guys. Very talented. Very heavy. I could see myself picking the songs that I liked out of the heavy ones and even throwing in some of the more ambitious tracks on here in my rotation. But as a whole, this record's just too much, man. It's way too much. I could see myself giving this a 6 or a 7 if it was trimmed up a bit, but it's just not for me. Carly Rae Jepsen was like, you guys like the emotion side B? You like me presenting more of that tone? Well, here's a whole second album for the Dedicated era. And I realized I hadn't talked about this, nor had I spent as much time with this as I would have liked, and given I'm planning a thing next year with this, if you caught the Patreon post I made about it. But I figured I'd talk about it. I'd give an opinion on these tracks. And I like them. I like Dedicated. I thought it was more Carly Rae doing Carly Rae things, doing some more sonic experiments that I thought worked for the most part. And Dedicated Side B is more of that. I think that this actually starts better than Dedicated did. I didn't hate Julian, but I didn't think it was the starter that a follow-up to a record like Emotion really asked for. It was a lot more subdued, which kind of fits some of the more laid-back atmospheres that Dedicated has, but I think it would have been nice to start off on at least a bombastic cut. You know, it closes on a bombastic cut, but it opens kind of on a more soft note. And I think this Love Isn't Crazy actually is a better opener out of the two. But it also has some more sleek, you know, sort of more minimalist songs like Window or Heartbeat or Summer Love that are kind of minimalist in their own different ways. Summer Love just kind of having this tight groove that also comes up again on Let's Sort the Whole Thing Out. But tracks like Heartbeat and the closer Now I Don't Hate California After All have this more hazier sound to them. And the track Comeback with the Bleachers also shares that kind of sound. And I like those tracks. I think that they're a little too frequent on this project, but I think that some of them work. I actually really like the Bleachers collaboration a lot, and I like the closure as well. But tracks like Fake Mona Lisa spend a little too much time in this minimalist haziness that doesn't add as much as those tracks. It's still very solid. I like it about as much as Dedicated for the same reason. And like I said, I'll be doing something next year with this record, so this won't be the last time I talk about it. But I feel like lyrically, it's not as bold as Dedicated, but sonically, it's trying to compete, and I feel like it does. I give this a 7. It's what I gave Dedicated B. It's still very bright, still very shiny. When it shines bright, it shines just as bright as Dedicated. It just also has just as many follies, if not for different reasons, than Dedicated did. If you like Dedicated, listen to this. You probably already have, because it's November. So the St. John album, While the World Was Burning, was also recommended to me by a different friend from work. Shout out to Antoine. He asked what I thought of this project, and I already talked to him about it. We've We've already discussed what I liked about it and stuff. But I figured I would come on here. It's a new record, something for me to talk about for the listening log. I talk about all the new records. And I enjoyed this project. You know, we were talking about how St. John's kind of trying to tap into that sad dude trap hazy lane that dudes like Uzi Vert are trying to do as well. But I feel like at least St. John approaches it a little more concisely, and he also just sounds better than not only dudes like Uzi Vert, but dudes like Future. You know, it makes sense that he would have dudes like them and DaBaby and Boogie With a Hoodie on this project, and even Kanye, because he talks about wanting to be the new Kanye West. But his voice works really well with autotune in a way that some of those dudes just don't. You know, and he matches that hazy sound a lot better. You know, I love tracks like the opener, Sucks to Be You. I think that it paints a picture of him living through homelessness incredibly well. It's very dark and fits the mood. You know, or tracks like High School Reunion, where he's sort of, in the chorus of that track, tries to channel that high school hopefulness, post-high school, while also reflecting on where he's at now in tandem with that, you know? Or what he does with Roses, the TikTok song. I think he suits the track well, and I like what he does with it. I like the track Pray For Me with Kanye. I think Kanye does a decent track on there, or decent collaboration with him as well, and I think the two kind of bounce off of each other decently well. Same with Quarantine Wifey. I love his vocal work and his harmonies on there, and his talks about being in quarantine with this girl that he doesn't want to be with like that. I like this record. I think it's very solid. Do I think everything works? No. I don't really like DaBaby on Monica Lewinsky, Election Year. I think that track as a whole just kind of comes off a little flat. I still am not the biggest Future fan, so him on Roses, he doesn't really do anything for me. I like Ransom. It's not my favorite track on the record, but I think it's a solid enough track. It's not as much of a highlight as some of the ones I've already talked about. And I don't like Gorgeous. I don't know. I just don't think he pulls off the Flex track all that well. But even Uzi Vert, I think Uzi Vert's fine, and he pairs really well on High School Reunion. You know, this record is very solid. I think it's very, very solid. And I feel like if you like trap, if you like moodier, darker hip hop, and you want a dude that's kind of trying to tap into that lane in a similar way of dudes that I've already mentioned, I'd give this a spin. I think that you would get some enjoyment out of it, maybe even more enjoyment than me. You know, I think this is solid. I think it's an all right record, and I feel like it's definitely not the worst thing I've heard in its lane this year or at all. And I would like to see St. John do more. I'd be keeping my ear out for this guy personally, just to hear what he does, just to hear how he sounds on a beat, how he evolves his voice, what other subjects does he want to talk about. You know, I think this is all right. I give it like a 6 out of 10. It's not bad at all. It's actually very, very solid. I'll plant a garden in the yard. I saw a lot of the internet praising this record, this Phoebe Bridgers record, Punisher, and I put it on the back burner. I kept saying, I'll get to it, and I was like, well, I'm in fall now. This is like a chamber folk sort of album. Let's throw it on while it's cold and sad, and I'm sad, and man, is it fitting. I like this record a lot, and I don't think it's because I spun it at the right time either. I think that the sounds on this record are well put together. You know, I love the lushness on a majority of this record, but I like how she interpolates different things at different points. You know, the opener, DVD Menu, Garden Song, is a great 1-2 punch of that style, very dreamlike in an aesthetic. But tracks like Punisher and Halloween, and especially Halloween and a track like ICU, do a lot to change it up. You know, those twinkling sounds with the guitar on Halloween and Connor Oberst's vocals with hers pair incredibly well together. You know, ICU has a little more propulsion to it. It's one of the few moments of propulsion in the track listing, but it showcases this sort of bitter picture that a track like that really pairs well between the forerun of songs from Moonsong through Graceland 2, really deconstructing relationships and the sort of savior complex that could stem from living in the culture that we're in now, to bitter breakups in ICU, to the fleeting memories you may have during that relationship with Graceland 2 that, you know, it sort of surmises a lot of the lyrical themes the record's going into, talking about, you know, having one last release of dopamine together, you know, sharing these great memories. And I love that about it. I love the real personal touch that this record has. I love the writing on ICU and how well it's constructed in comparison, and the metaphorical writing used there, you know. And again, the nuanced detail in a track like Savior Complex, or a track like on the opposite side of that spectrum, Kyoto, which is, again, a really well detail-oriented written song, but is the one real ounce of happiness that this record has to give. You know, it's detailing Phoebe's time in Japan, and it's done so incredibly well in this tight-knit rock jam. Or a track like the bombastic closer, I Know the End, which again is another moment of sort of propulsion and bombast in an otherwise dreary release. You know, this record holds on to its atmosphere and keeps you embedded into it, but knows when to break it up at the perfect time. And the closer itself kind of fits, because it's a closer and it's opening the scope. It's not as insular. It's talking about the world at large, and it feels fitting. You know, this record is incredibly well constructed. I really like the comparisons in songwriting. Like I said, I like the textures when they're there. I love the overall dreariness of it. I love Phoebe's performance on here as well. She has a very haunting voice at times that is also incredibly beautiful. I love this record. I feel like if you love indie music, if you love like indie guitar, folk, chambers stuff, if you want a good sad record to spin during the fall time, you can't go wrong with this. There's a reason why the internet's hyping up, and I totally get it. And consider me a part of the hype train, man, because this record fucking slays. I think that she got real talent. Makes me want to listen to her debut, and I feel like you would feel the same way following listening to this record. But I'm giving this a 9 out of 10. So following Phoebe Bridgers, I was like, well, let's spin another folk record. And Fleet Foxes dropped a surprise record at the end of September at a more poignant time. You know, they know their sound. This is their 4th record. They know how to do folk and chamber music really, really well. And I loved my introduction to the band. Their last record, Crack Up, which saw them throwing a lot of progressive, you know, ideas and movements and structures in with that folk root. And I was hoping for more of that, I'm sure. And while I don't get that, I do like what's here a lot. I think that it's very, very well harnessed. It shows a band that knows, again, their sound and knows how to make it work. You know, they keep things paced pretty well with tracks like Waiting in the Waist-High Water or Jara or For a Week or Two, which see them doing their multi-layered vocal lines and some decent hook work here and there on tracks like Jara or Maestra Naza or Young Man's Game, which seems a little more reflective in its writing, or A Long Way Past the Past. You know, this record does a decent job at constructing a good, tight atmosphere that the band plays on really well, whether it's atmospheric, propulsive, or just tight groove-wise. My biggest issue is that it's a little more cut and dry across the board. You know, they do some cool stuff like on Quiet Air, Giola, or Going to the Sun Road. I love the closer, the title track. But across the board, the record just doesn't feel as sonically engaging as Crack Up did, and that's kind of upsetting. You know, again, it's a very solid record. I feel like if you're a fan of well-constructed, nuanced in a arrangement style, you know, indie folk, you'll like this record just the same. But personally, what drew me to them wasn't just that. It was their ability to craft some well-constructed progressive tracks or some good songwriting on top of that. And while there is great songwriting on here, don't get me wrong, this record feels more bogged down and bloated by its desire to have these more ambient-driven interludes or these layered vocal harmonies that do nothing but texture the sounds in a way that, because the song itself doesn't have a whole lot going on, feels a little more underwhelming. This is still a very solid record, and I sound like I'm being incredibly critical of it, if only because I liked Crack Up a lot, and I liked what it was trying to do a lot. But this feels like a lesser, more safer record. Again, not bad, fitting for the times that we're in, temperature-wise, but I don't see myself spinning this outside of when it's fitting for the season. I feel like, again, if you like the stuff, you'll like it. I enjoy it, but I personally would listen to Crack Up and maybe even finally dive into their first couple of records before I would spin this again. I'm giving this a 7 out of 10 though. Still a very solid record, but a little disappointing given how much I like their last record.
Trigger, but how you gonna run it? Fuck your season, nigga. That's the reason I go for it.
I've been trying to keep my eye on Detroit rapper Elzhi ever since his Elmatic tape dropped and sort of swept the internet up in a frenzy, because this guy penned some pretty decent bars over the Elmatic instrumentals. And while I thought his last record, Lead Poison, was relatively average, it had a lot of your standard boom bap style production, and maybe I have to revisit it, but I don't really have many fun memories of that project. I reviewed it on the log, I put it on a pre-video listening log back when it dropped. But I'm always interested to see what he cooks up. And he dropped a record late September called 7 Times Down, 8 Times Up, and I finally checked it out. And while a lot of the production, by and large, is still pretty average in the veins of like smooth, jazzy, lo-fi beats, lyrically and at least presentation-wise, Elzhi is kind of stepping up his game a little bit more. You know, while there were allegories about being a Martian, I do remember that from the last record, really talking about being an outcast. That isn't super prevalent on this record. On this project, he's seemingly trying to create a couple of different types of tracks. You know, he has tracks like Early Bird Night Owl, where he kind of reflects on and kind of talks about the game in general and talks about people's stances in it reflectively, kind of cutting down those that aren't as hot as they think they are in a really smooth sort of way. He kind of does something similar on Masterclass, where he kind of talks about teaching the people how it really is, you know, being real with people, and as far as like how the streets are and stuff like that. And I feel like he pulls together those tracks like that incredibly well. He also does tracks that aren't too dissimilar from stuff dudes in the alternative hip-hop lane do. Like a track like Ferndale, which is like a hip-hop love song, it has some really cutesy imagery and very nuanced imagery in its lyrics. You know, he name drops a lot of stuff from Detroit. It's based on a real story of him and this girl that he had to like a summer fling with, or like a relationship with for a while. And it's cute. He also has a track like G.O.D. where he, you know, compares so many things that under the acronym G.O.D. that mean different things, but all could be things that people worship. He's trying to get real deep with ya, the listener, which are fine. I like those songs. They're sort of standard fare for your average alternative hip hop record. But I also like the weird 2 horror tinged tracks that he does. He does Thugged Out Zombies, which is just a track about zombies rising up. It takes place, it starts at the end, and then the story of the song works its way back to the beginning. You know, it starts with Elle walking into this trap house that was recently vacated, and he grabs a pistol off the table that isn't his, and then explains why he would do that, given that it's not something you typically want to do. You never want to pick up a stranger's gun because you don't know where it's been. But in a zombie apocalypse, who the fuck cares? And he really, again, through really detailed storytelling, breaks down how the zombie apocalypse came to be. And it's a well-constructed track. And Jason puts himself in the shoes of the Friday the 13th mascot, Jason. He has some ch-ch-ch-ahs in the chorus that I think are a nice touch. And it's a cool way to close out this record. You know, while this record, by the by, still has some of the same follies or sort of idiosyncrasies I thought his last record did, he at least pulls those off a little more gracefully this time and spices up the track listing with some better done storytelling, both fantastical and autobiographical. I think this record's really solid, honestly. I like Elzhi's pen game here, or at least what would be his pen game on Hot Winter Cold Summer. He talks about, or Light One Right One, he talks about how he doesn't write anything anymore. He leaves his pen and pad at home, and he's trying to be like one of the greats in that regard, which is fine, whatever. But his pen game is cool on here. His verbiage and his flow, verse, his like word structure, his rhyme structure is really done. Sometimes it's a little played out. His flow can get a little atonal at points, but it's harmless, by the by. I've heard worse rap, but I've also heard a decent chunk better. I'm going to be giving this a 7, though, like a light 7. This would be like on that threshold between a 6 and a 7. I do really like it. I think it's very solid. I think El's talents shine a lot more on here than his last record, and I'm sure I'll be remembering tracks from this more than I will from his last project. And the last record I checked out this month was the newest King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard record, KG, which is another sequence in what is, I guess, going to be a series of them exploring microtonal tuning. Something they explored on one of my favorite records of theirs, Flying Microtonal Banana. I love the guitar sounds on that, and it's something that sort of was a bridge from one of the tracks on Nonagon Infinity. They made a whole record out of the tuning LO1 songs of that, and now they made a second record where they explore that tuning in different instrumental styles and different sonic textures. And I think it comes across pretty well. You know, tracks like the opener, KGLW, and Automation, and Minimum Brain Size almost kind of feel like the last extensions of the sonic palette from Microtonal Banana, before tracks like Stars in the Wind and Anthology kind of add a little more of an acoustic flair to it, a little more of an acoustic forefront. They get a little less lo-fi and gritty on the production on a lot of this record with tracks like that. Tracks like Some of Us have this more sort of slower groove to them while also interpolating that tuning. Straight up just has some synthesizer grooves in there that I think come across pretty well. The track Honey is another really soft, almost ballad-esque moment in that tuning. The closer, The Hungry Wolf of Fate, is almost an extension of their Infest the Rat's Net sound. It's a lot heavier. The production on that track is so heavy. The guitars crunch in a way that's even heavier than Infest the Rat's Net. And as a fan of that record, I'm glad that they didn't lose that heavier tendency. This is not really thrash-based, it's more like traditional doom style, which I really enjoy and think comes across incredibly well. By the way, I think this record's great. Do I think it's as dazzling as Flying Microtonal? No, I've actually loved that record the more that I revisit it. There's no Rattlesnake on there where they kind of take that idea and sort of expand both upon Nonagon's sort of propulsive sounds into something in that tuning a lot more successfully. But it's a fun record. There's a lot of cool sounds that they explore. I love what they do with the tuning here. I love how they incorporate more traditional Eastern instrumentation on here in tandem with some of those acoustic elements. Again, I like the synth cut on here. I think that's really cool. I'd love to see them do more synth-driven stuff in this style, or just in general. I like this record. It almost feels like kind of what Gumboot Soup was. Gumboot Soup, where it's sort of them taking a lot of ideas that they have and putting them into a melting pot, only the pot is seasoned with this microtonal seasoning that sort of coats all the flavors in this sheen. And it's really cool. I think that if you liked Flying Microtonal Banana, you'll at least enjoy the sort of extensions of that sonic concept on here. You know, I don't know how much mileage they'll get out of this concept, but I think they made a good companion record to Flying Microtonal Banana, a record that, again, has continued to age really highly to me. It's not my favorite, but it's up there. It's like one of my 3 favorite King Gizzard records. It's one of the ones I'll revisit the most from the year that it came out. Or actually, it is from that year the one that I'll revisit the most because it's the most sonically compelling. But yeah, this is cool. It's got some cool ideas, some cool psychedelic lyrical threads. I really like the picturesque writing on Minimum Brain Size. And again, I like the cutesiness of Honey as well. They do their thing. They do their King Gizzard weird songwriting, and they just kind of paint it really well with that microtonal sound. It's really solid. I think it's a great record. Far from the worst thing they've done. It's pretty up there. I give it like a 7 out of 10. It's a really solid release, for sure. Just a little too scattershot for what I would expect from King Gizzard. And that's gonna be it. That's my month. That's what I thought of the records that I listened to this month. As you can see, it took me all day to pull this together. What did you think of these reviews? Did you like them? If you did, be sure to give it a like. If you have any thoughts about my thoughts, or again, if you have a record that you want me to check out before the year's done, leave it in the comments down below. If you want to see what albums I've covered, the listening log is also linked down there. I'm going to get out of here. If you like this, like it. If you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general nerdery content, be sure to subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons. If you want to join their ranks to get early access to content, exclusive content, or to help drive the community, it's linked in the description. I have been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day!